Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webcast, wherever you're listening from in the world today. All right. Okay, so for today's session, we have a couple of speakers. My name is Claes Nordahl, and I'm a Customer Success Manager with Bizagi. I'm based out of our California office in Santa Clara, and it's also going to be my great pleasure today to introduce our session, How to Shape Digital Transformation for Operational Efficiency, and it will be led by Derek Miers. He is a Principal Analyst of Industry Research and Advisory Service firm, MWD Advisors, and it's based in the UK. Okay, so real quick, what we'll talk about today. I will start with a very brief introduction of Bizagi, and then Derek Miers will talk us through how to shape digital transformation for operational efficiency. We're going to take about 5 minutes to answer some questions. Along the way in the presentation today, feel free to post them in the web session here, and we'll try to answer those. If there are some questions that we don't get to answer, we will follow up with them after the presentation. Okay, so first of all, let me talk a little bit about Bizagi. Bizagi is a digital platform, and it enables the digital process automation process. We have about 500 enterprise customers worldwide today. We're headquartered in the UK, and we have operations across America, Europe, Latin America. Many of you might know us as a BPM provider. You may have downloaded our world-famous BPM modeler, and that's a great platform, and it's been used extensively across many industries. You may also know us as a digital transformation provider, and we've really been working with customers, helping them wrapping their legacy systems with an agile, process-centric application layer, and delivering engaging and connected experiences to digitize their operations. Here's a quick view of some of our customers. These are all, you recognize some brand names here. There are about 500 of them enterprise-wide. And here's also a few of our global partners. A couple of takeaways here is, one is that you'll notice that they are from a broad distribution of industries, and many of them are really established companies that's been around for a long time, and you can call them incumbent players, if you will. And these are companies that, by definition, are often those that feel most challenged by the new entrants into the market, the companies called so-called born digital. And Bizagi is now working with them to really digitize their businesses and transform how they operate. Okay, so without further ado, let me here introduce Derek Miers. He will talk to us about how to shape digital transformation for operational efficiencies. Derek, please.
Hi, good afternoon. Well, it's certainly afternoon here. I know it's early morning for you in California, but I'm in the hottest day in 40 years here on summer solstice in London, so it's pretty damn warm. So I'm going to talk through how to shape digital transformation for operational efficiency. It's a bit of a stretch in many people's minds. You know, if you think digital transformation, it's sort of you know, it's been mandated by the senior execs, COO, CEO, to deliver some sort of savings that the business needs to survive. But the question becomes, you know, like, how? How are you going to do that? And I suppose this little quote here I pulled directly from the COO and president of a $66 billion insurance organisation that I've worked with in the past, and he was really talking to the transformation teams going, well, if you haven't got me that 40% labour productivity improvement, you haven't finished yet. And I suppose the other phrase I'd put along here is almost like, if you really get to grips with the executives at the senior levels in these large organisations, which many of you are working within, it's like they really don't want to waste this opportunity. They know they don't have a second chance here. And I suppose I'm going to try and give you a framework for how everything, sort of how you can hang it all together and bring home a home run, as it were. And I don't have much time to do it in, so I have to sort of move on quickly. I particularly liked this model that Geoffrey Moore posed, and he started talking about, there are different types of transformations that are going on, right? Change in infrastructure model, a change in operating model, a change in business model. Let's quickly sort of consider what's really going on here. The infrastructure model is about your technology and operations. The operating model is how you organize yourselves to create that effectiveness, to create the scalable business organization. And the business model, of course, is how do we make sure we don't get Uberized or Airbnb or some other startup coming along and nibbling away at your boots, as it were, and stealing customers day to day. But you know what? To change all of this, to really make the change, business transformation really means being prepared to change pretty much everything you do. But most importantly, how you think. Now, that little quote I pulled from the COO of Barclays Wealth, as was at the time, and it was a sort of, to me, it was a throwaway line in a conference presentation, but I thought it was fundamental, because really what he was getting at was really you have to change how you think about change, right? How you go about delivering that value, and how you manage change, and how you think about cost, and how you engage your people, and how you think about innovation, and how you manage exceptions and handle variation. I mean, they're all different sorts of things you've got to have in your armory almost to successfully get through this. And yes, delivering the operational efficiency and reducing cost is something you can do along the way, but you don't want to start off with that as the primary objective. Now, I'm going to just sort of run forward here, and when you think about it, even the metrics of change are changing. This traditional view, and I put it here, productivity equals value divided by resources. And if you think that's a fair way of calculating productivity without measuring inputs and outputs and some other long thing, but if you try and get your head around that, and what happens in most traditional businesses, that cost reduction piece, it's normally about reducing the resources required to deliver a given value. The value stays constant, but the resources go down. To me, that's not really transformation, because at the other end of the scale is the sort of exploration concept, right, which is where value really is becoming more about how do you optimize the outcome given the limited resources available to you. And it's a fundamentally sort of different way of thinking. And I suppose I just sort of wrote the slide up a bit, but, can you have both? The short answer is probably yes, you need to have both. It's not an either or, it's a both and. At one level, on the one hand, it's this productivity, do things right. That's the world of operational excellence and the world of lean and what have you. At the other end of the scale is do the right things, which is really the world of innovation and design thinking. On the left, change is imposed. On the right, you get emergent change and a more sustainable outcome. But in the end, sort of digital transformation comes down to designing that wellness program rather than just another Band-Aid project. This notion of a digital transformation project, it's like an oxymoron. You can't have a digital transformation project because there's no end in sight. You are going to be continually on this loop. And you have to start thinking about how you're going to deliver that wellness program, how you're going to start thinking about the ways in which you deliver better value and more value. And yes, we can get the efficiency along the way, but That's really what we're looking at. Now, I'm going to present to you a sort of a derived framework based on observation of literally thousands of change programs. Over the years, I've carried out both qualitative, quantitative studies of organizational change initiatives. Call them digital transformation, call them business transformation, call them Lean Six Sigma, the whole 9 yards, but they're not that dissimilar about how people run change. And I suppose what I'm going to try and do is talk to you not so much about band-aids and quick fixes, but it's a framework for a wellness program is what I'm trying to communicate here. I'd love to have shown you a sort of nice, neat 2x2 structure, but it's, in a way it's a lot more complex than that. This is a pretty broad framework within which lots of other approaches and techniques fit. And I'm going to talk about, I suppose, everything from where customer journey mapping, lean, BPM, decision management, they all have a place. But let's start with the 0 point almost. The 0 point, in the bottom left-hand corner here is what I call faux transformations, false ones, which are pure cost reduction and downsizing exercises, or pure organizational restructuring exercise, or some new server or core software infrastructure platform. It's not really fundamentally about delivering a new form of value. And ultimately, I'm going to try and sort of walk through a way of getting your head around these different dimensions. And I'm going to go through each one in turn. So let's take the Y dimension first, right? You need to start off by understanding the customer's experience. And then that leads to service design, the sort of outside-in design thinking sort of thing, which if you do it right, leads to a certain amount of business model reinvention. This is reinventing the future outside in, if you like, or inventing the future outside in. If I run forward to the X dimension, this is really, I suppose what I'm starting to talk about now is how your organization learns, and that's the start point, because without that, you're going nowhere. For example, and I was at another event earlier on, and I was hearing from a senior executive, BNY Mellon, and by the way, we're talking here a bank that deals with $3 trillion a day in payments and $30 trillion worth of assets. They have a business performance, COE, that starts every Friday with a weekly meeting saying, what did we learn and how can we avoid that in the future? That's their learning organizational core, if you like. But that group also had to have, or needs to have, any of these sorts of groups, is permission to fail. It's this thing in the middle, this building, engagement and co-creation that really is the core of this framework. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But, it's just like sort of Hannibal, when he was trying to invade Rome. He had to take the army with him. And in a way, that's what your challenge is to bring the people in the organization with you so that you can then start thinking about revamping your operating model, which really is what this X dimension is about. It's about revamping your operating model so that you can scale it, so that you know which bits are core or which bits you're going to partner with and where you're going to outsource and what have you. And that's fairly challenging for most, and indeed this dimension is the one that is most found lacking, in my opinion. Finally, in terms of these three dimensions, the Z dimension here, if you like, this is the technology and process dimension. You could think of it like this. The systems of modernization references the idea of your systems of record. You put wrappers around them with processes and better definitions of rules and better user interfaces, and really what you're generally creating are systems of engagement, right? And ultimately, if you do this right, you end up with systems of analytics, intelligence. I'm going back to references from Geoffrey Moore again, but you're really about completely revamping here your infrastructure model. Okay, so just to make sure we're clear here, this is the infrastructure model. The one before, and I'm going to go back one. This is about the operating model, and I'm going to go back one. This is about the business model. So if you keep those three things in mind as we move forward, now I'm going to try and bring them all together for you on one side, and you can see why I didn't go there to begin with. These are these three dimensions together, and I've tried to use color here to talk about how you move through this framework. The point to understand from all of this is that you can't just run hell for leather down the infrastructure model, the systems dimension, without doing a lot of good work about engaging and your stakeholders and actually building out the capacity and appetite for change. And at the same time, you're starting to work out how to sort of reinvent the way in which you deliver value as an organization. Now, I suppose the point I really want to touch on here and really want to stress is that you have to work all three of these areas together. You can't just go down one dimension or the other one. They all need to be working together in sync. And how are we doing for time? We're probably pretty good. I mean, ultimately, I've now tried to map it out as a bit more of a traditional journey, and you notice I'm calling them chapters here. You know, there's a certain degree of setup involved in terms of how do you scope and develop the program, the plans to make things right. You know, the executive stakeholders set the trajectory, align the politics, all those sorts of things. By the way, that point, align the politics, is probably the most important thing towards ensuring these sorts of programs are successful. You know, this chapter 1 here is about the culture and the learning culture that you need to create. It's about understanding your customers' true experience of the firm, not just where they are today, but you know what that is in the context of why you're losing them and all those sorts of things. It's voice of the customer and all those sorts of techniques. Systems modernization, that's where you start to put system level wrappers around some of those systems. It's not as though they're going to be going away anytime soon, but you've got to start thinking about how you're going to leverage access to them. And by the way, that's where the RPA world sort of starts to come into it, because of course it allows you to put a layer over the top of what you're doing. But you end up with this, what I'm describing here is this chapter 2, the all-important part, which is about developing service propositions. It's about engaging your colleagues into co-creation, designing that future together. And it's also about the point where you start to really leverage the process and decision automation that becomes possible. And finally, you get to this point of potential business model reinvention. You can't just jump straight from setup to business model reinvention. You know, you've got to go through these earlier chapters. I hope that is relatively clear here. Now, I said I was going to come back to this engagement mechanism, and this is the core of a workshop technique that we use to engage large numbers of people to think about how they're going to rework their organization, the service propositions, and rework that operation model. And really it comes down to, within each service, you really need to think both combining the sort of design thinking outside-in world with the operational excellence, this inside-out view of the world, right? If you think about your relationship with your bank, a personal relationship, you really don't care how they're organized. You don't care about their functions. You only care about the value that they deliver to you and the experience that comes out the other end of it. Of course, from the internal point of view, there's a lot of, how would I put it, you know, there's this view of needing to drive efficiency and risk reduction. We've got to work out a way of bringing these two worlds together. Now, I suppose let's start, you know, what it comes down to is, for each service proposition that you really need to think about, you need to worry about who's it for, build a persona of what that's all about. You know, that persona is a sort of characterization of whose problem you're solving, and that context, if you like, what's their job to be done, what are they buying our organization for this service to deliver for them, right? And if you can do that, you can then start to think about, well, what is that service consumer, that customer journey in the context of that job to be done? You notice I didn't say what's their customer journey through our, I was going to say through our crap, you know, through our systems, our ways of engaging with them. No, what's their journey in the large? You know, Joe and Sue just got married. They're thinking of buying a house. It's not so much how do they engage the bank to get a mortgage, but, you know, that might be, what would you then get to? What would be the experience that you'd want to deliver as part of that wider journey that they're in? And then you can start to think about, well, what's the service proposition that delivers on that journey? And I suppose ultimately that service proposition, of course, becomes a reflection of that design that you're looking for in that customer experience. And that service proposition actually is a set of configured business capabilities. Now, I'm saying that slowly and carefully because I suppose I'm getting at now the components of the organization that are, in the end, implemented through processes, application, information, technology, resources. They may be external. The point is, you have to really start thinking about this top down. You've got to start engaging your colleagues to create their vision of the future this outside in sort of way, rather than starting at the bottom trying to work your way upwards, because it just doesn't work. And you know, that's ultimately, I suppose, the core of this. And I'm going to show you an example of an organization I worked with a year or so ago, really talking about, in this case, they were setting up a new business architecture function. And this was and I'm giving you a obviously modified schematic and anonymized and what have you, but here they were setting out how they support a new capability owner being appointed inside the organization. The capability owner, think like credit as a capability, you know, it manifests in terms of credit cards and mortgages, in bank loans, in student loans and what have you, but also in the wholesale bank and wealth management, there are aspects of credit. You can't say that the credit process has to be standardized and operated in all those different places from one core central way. No, it's this notion of this purpose called credit is implemented in different ways. Now, I use the word purpose there, and ultimately that's what I really think business capabilities are. But here, when you read through this, you can see that new capability owner is appointed. They have a discussion with the chief business architect. You know, establish the to-be vision for this capability. Then we're going to do an assessment of how that all works. And within that, you can see some dotted lines and solid lines. In fact, this capability assessment here is in itself a complete service proposition that can be applied to a number of different scenarios. Similarly, a portfolio prioritization workshop is a component of something that we might be able to standardize and be able to customize particularly for this particular example. I'll come back to this. I think it's the next slide, but I suppose I'm trying to give you a way here, a way of thinking about how you can approach digital transformation and delivering the sort of outcomes that you really need. Because, of course, as people design this new version of the future, that's when you get to design in the efficiency you need. Now, why am I pausing on this slide? Because it's really about the, you know, those underpinning supporting service components here. They could be configured into a set of services provided, in this case, by the bank's business architecture team, which in turn are then specialized for the different business units within the organization. You could think about whether or not it's an internal operation or an organization in terms of how it componentizes its value and delivers it to different classes of customer and specializes a number of standardized capabilities or common capabilities that are then put into services that are then specialized by different segments in the market. And in a way, this gives you a way of thinking about how you're going to solve for that difficult problem. I mean, ultimately, you know, this is a pretty challenging change, you know, to go through. I've described here the examples I just gave were a department delivering services to business units and what have you. But imagine you were shared services, right? If you're a shared services operation, I'm just going to go back again. If you're a shared services operation, you could think about how you delivered services to the rest of your business and allowed them to then be specialized. Or if you are, you know, if you're actually a business to consumer scenario, exactly the same sort of architecture you could use, architectural framework you could use, whether or not, you know, you're RBS or just a small boutique bank, it would still work, right? The point here is that you use the overall approach to scale the change program. You get people to design their future. If you engage them properly and they build it out, it becomes theirs. Think of this, that workshop format I was talking about as a big tent workshop with multiple quasi-competitive teams. You could be working on unrelated concepts or codependent projects. For instance, the first time that I ran that workshop style was with that big insurance company I was talking about earlier on, where the original quote came from. And in that case, in one day, they went from zero to hero. They charted 12 codependent projects that had to work out how they were going to deliver on the efficiency of the objectives of the COO. And that quote was really put in that context of getting to the end, put in that context of how you're going to get me that labor productivity improvement that we're just talking about. My point is that, this is a sort of maturity journey, right? On the left here, you've got the sort of traditional siloed organization. Think CMMI level 2. Siloed organization. The boss tells us what to do. We have control at the business unit level or the functional level. In the middle here, you've got the outcomes being used to support the processes. Hold on. Yes, I said that right. The outcomes, the cross-functional processes, are typically there to make the functions look good. If you look at the metrics of what's going on, that's still the case. But by the time you get to the right, the functions are there to make the outcomes look good. And this is CMMI level 4 on the right. And if I characterize a conversation with the chief scientist of GE about this journey, he said they've been in this movement here in the middle between 3 and 4, the functions supported by processes versus processes supported by functions, for the last 40 years. It's always 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 2 steps forward, whatever. It's a challenging change. It's about power, and it's about how to help executives also understand their role in delivering on this, because often the real challenges in making this change are often born and bred and living in the boardroom and the executive team. And very often we've found ourselves helping executive teams really manage their, conflicts that they have internally about how to make this happen. Now, I've got a couple of minutes left, and I'm going to use it just to talk about this maturity journey. At level 1, you're used to seeing maturity journeys going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 up to the right? Level 1, it's at the level of the individual. Everybody does it their own way. It's a bit of a mess. Level 2, where most businesses are, is actually really getting repeatable processes operating at the functional or the business practice level, or whatever you want to call it, the business unit. And this is where the challenge comes, going to that enterprise level, which people talk about as standardized processes. But in fact, it's not so much standardization, it's identifying that which is common across the organization and industrializing that so that then you can specialize that for different segments of customer and having an adapted proposition based on those common components. And as you're adapting them for different customer segments, you're doing it in the full knowledge that you know what it is that's going on here. And finally, ultimately, I suppose, you get to this point where your individuals, the people that work in the business, understand this so well that they can almost make up the proposition on the fly for this customer in this specific context. And all the time they're reinvesting the learnings that come out of that back in these common adapted processes for the different levels. And that's an interesting conversation to have once you start really getting into what's going on here. I'm going to leave you, and I'm sort of bang on the time money-wise. Bang on the time money-wise, a bit of a mixing up my metaphors. But look, I use this phrase, your furniture will not transform your organization. That's another quote. That's from in this case, the transformation leader at Lego, saying, your furniture will not transform your organization. You have to engage your people to do that. Technology is, relatively speaking, the easy part. If it doesn't work, get rid of it and get one that does. And by and large, Bizagi is one of the products that does work quite well. But it's the journey that the organization goes through that transforms. It's not some magical piece along the way. Now, going back to that final bit about where's the cost efficiency going to come from, you get that by designing the future and by ensuring that your teams, back to that point at the very beginning, you haven't finished yet until you've got me this goal. And in a way, as they do that, they'll deliver on those sort of outcomes. So I'll leave it there, and I'll hand it back to Travis.
Thank you, Derek. So, I mean, slide 4 here. We are sort of short on time, but let's see if there are some questions that we can take from the audience here. Let me just read off the first one. Can you give us a sense of how your co-creation method delivers on the cost reduction aspect? Doesn't it seem to fly in the face of accepted way of delivering cost reduction?
You're really saying how does it, sorry, just run that question again?
So you talked about the co-creation method. How does that deliver to the cost reduction aspect?
Yeah, I see where you're coming. Yeah. I mean, ultimately, if you think about it, when you engage your colleagues to design that vision of the future, that's when you get to build in the efficiency that you need and the cost reduction that you need within the organization. You get that cost reduction typically by reorganizing the operating model that is coming from, taking out the, we all have a finance function. If you're delivering parcels in 144 countries, why do you need 144 finance functions? You really want to have one very standardized way of thinking about delivering parcels, and the finance function probably can be based on one rather than having 144 of them. That's going to give you cost reduction. But you don't get there by imposing that on people, because then they'll just quietly resist the change and go the other way. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you. All right. I know there might be a couple of more questions out there. We are out of time, so we will follow up on those questions afterwards and respond in writing. Thank you so much for attending today. Really enjoyed having you on the call. I hope it's been very valuable for you. And also, there are some other sessions in this series. There are some references on the Bizagi website, so please check that out for the more for the additional sessions out there. There's also other great information like case studies, ebooks, e-learnings, etc. So with that, thank you, Derek, very much for your time today, and hope to see you soon again.